size matters. In the history of warfare, there has always been a delusional dream of building a machine so large it could end a war by its mere presence. Today, we're looking at 5 iron giants that tried to dominate the battlefield with pure scale. From a literal tricycle from hell to a German bunker on tracks, these are the top 5 largest tanks ever built. Spoiler alert, they were all magnificent disasters. Let's get into it. The Panzer VIII Maus is the ultimate monument to the Third Reich's obsession with Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. Born from a direct order by Adolf Hitler to Ferdinand Porsche, this machine was never intended to be a practical vehicle, but rather a mobile fortress that could crush anything in its path. Weighing in at a staggering 188 tons, it remains the heaviest fully enclosed armored fighting vehicle ever built. Its sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. It was nearly 10 meters long and 3.6 meters high, making it a terrifying shadow on the horizon for any Allied scout who might have glimpsed its testing. The protection of the Maus was its primary selling point and its greatest curse. The turret armor alone was 240 millimeters thick, which, by 1944 standards, made it virtually invulnerable to any tank gun or anti-tank artillery in existence. Even the powerful Soviet 122 mm guns or the American 90 mm cannons would have likely seen their shells shatter or ricochet harmlessly off its sloped steel plates. It was designed to lead the charge into the heart of enemy formations, absorbing thousands of rounds while suffering no significant damage, serving as an indestructible shield for the infantry following behind. To destroy the enemies of the Reich, the Maus was armed with a massive 128 mm KWK-44 gun, capable of obliterating any Allied tank from a distance of over 3 kilometers. As if that wasn't enough, it also featured a coaxial 75 mm gun for secondary targets, effectively giving it the firepower of 2 heavy tanks in a single chassis. The internal volume required to house the ammunition for these monsters, along with the massive crew of 6, made the interior feel like a cramped industrial basement rather than a cutting-edge military machine. However, the laws of physics are not easily ignored, and the Maus was a logistical death trap. Its massive weight meant that it couldn't use standard roads without crushing them, and bridges were out of the question as they would collapse instantly under its pressure. To solve the river crossing problem, the Germans developed a bizarre snorkel system. One Maus would sit on the bank and provide electrical power via a cable to a second Maus, which would drive completely submerged along the riverbed. This was a complex, slow, and dangerous procedure that would have been impossible to perform under enemy fire. The engine was another point of failure. Despite being powered by a modified 1,200 horsepower aircraft engine, the Maus could only reach a top speed of 13 km per hour on a flat, paved surface. In actual combat conditions or soft mud, it moved even slower, making it a stationary target for heavy bombers. It consumed fuel at a rate that was catastrophic for a Germany that was already running out of oil. A single Maus required thousands of liters of petrol just to move a few dozen miles, a luxury the Wehrmacht simply couldn't afford during the desperate final months of the war. In the end, the Maus was a ghost of a weapon. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, and only one actually had a functional turret. Neither of them ever fired a shot in a real battle. As the Soviet Red Army closed in on the testing grounds at Kummersdorf, the German engineers blew the prototypes up to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands. Today, the only surviving Maus is a hybrid made from the parts of both wrecks, sitting silently in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, a massive, rusted reminder that in war, being big is often just a fancy way of being useless. In 1914, at the dawn of the Great War, a Russian engineer named Nikolai Lebedenko proposed a machine that looked less like a tank and more like a fever dream from a steampunk novel. Known officially as the Netapir, but remembered by history as the Tsar tank, it was an attempt to overcome the brutal terrain of the Eastern Front using sheer height. Lebedenko convinced the Russian High Command, and even the Tsar himself, that a machine with wheels the size of a 3-story building could roll over trenches, fallen trees, and fortifications as if they were pebbles. The visual design of the Tsar tank was nothing short of insane. Instead of using the Caterpillar tracks that were being developed in Britain and France, Lebedenko opted for a giant tricycle configuration. The 2 front wheels were nearly 9 meters in diameter, featuring massive wooden spokes and iron rims. The idea was that these wheels would provide enough leverage to climb over any obstacle, while the central hull, perched high above the ground, would house a battery of cannons and machine guns to rain death down upon the enemy infantry from an untouchable height. The hull itself was a T-shaped steel structure that carried a crew of about 10 men. It was designed to have multiple turrets, one on top, one on the bottom, and others on the sides, providing a 360-degree field of fire. The Tsar was so impressed by a small wooden model that Lebedenko demonstrated in the palace that he immediately authorized the massive funding required to build the full-scale monster. It was a project born of royal vanity and engineering overconfidence, built at a time when Russia's industrial resources were already being pushed to the breaking point. Construction was completed in 1915, and the beast was transported in sections to a testing forest about 60 kilometers from Moscow. When reassembled, the Tsar tank was a terrifying sight, weighing over 60 tons and standing taller than most of the trees in the area. It was powered by two 250-horsepower Maybach engines, which were salvaged from a crashed German Zeppelin. The hope was that this power would be enough to move the giant tricycle across the rugged Russian landscape, but the first field test would quickly prove otherwise. Within minutes of starting its first run, the Tsar tank's fundamental design flaw became apparent. While the massive front wheels were successful in crushing everything in their path, the small rear wheel, which was only about 1.5 meters in diameter, acted like an anchor. Because of the weight distribution, the rear wheel immediately sank deep into the soft forest soil. The front wheels, despite their immense size, couldn't generate enough traction to pull the rear end out of the mud. The 60-ton monster simply groaned, dug itself deeper, and became permanently stuck. The failure was absolute and humiliating. The Russian military realized that any machine that could be defeated by a patch of soft dirt was useless on a real battlefield. Because the project was so expensive and difficult to move, they simply abandoned it where it sat. For the next 8 years, the Tsar tank remained in the forest, a strange metal skeleton slowly being reclaimed by nature. It wasn't until 1923 that it was finally dismantled for scrap metal, leaving behind nothing but a few grainy photographs of the tallest, most impractical tank ever conceived. The Char 2C stands as the ultimate French contribution to the era of super-heavy tanks, a literal landship that looks like it was plucked straight from the naval shipyards of the early 20th century. Conceived in the desperate final years of the Great War, this 69-ton monster was designed to break the German Hindenburg Line once and for all. It was the longest tank ever put into production, stretching over 10 meters in length, which gave it the unprecedented ability to cross trenches up to 4 meters wide without falling in. It was a masterpiece of industrial power, designed to be a mobile bunker that would lead the French army to total victory. Inside the steel hull of the Char 2C, the environment was more akin to a submarine than a vehicle. It required a massive crew of 12 men to operate, including a commander, a driver, several gunners, and specialized mechanics who had to monitor the engines constantly. The tank featured 2 separate turrets, a primary one at the front armed with a powerful 75mm cannon, and a smaller rear turret for a machine gun to protect against flanking infantry. This multi-turreted configuration made the Char 2C one of the most complex weapons of its time, a true marvel of French engineering that promised absolute dominance on the battlefield. However, the Char 2C was a victim of terrible timing and shifting military doctrines. By the time the first production units were ready, the First World War had already ended, leaving France with a fleet of 10 giant tanks and no enemies to fight. For the next 2 decades, the French military kept these behemoths in service primarily for propaganda purposes. They were featured in newsreels and parades, painted with the names of French provinces, and used to project an image of an invincible army. To the public, the Char 2C was a national hero, but to the generals, it was becoming a logistical nightmare that was increasingly difficult to maintain. The mobility of the Char 2C was its greatest weakness. Despite being powered by 2 massive Maybach or Mercedes engines, it could only reach a top speed of 12 or 15 kilometers per hour. Moving these tanks across France required specialized, heavy-duty railway wagons, as they were too wide and too heavy for standard transport. This meant that the deployment of the Char-2C was entirely dependent on a functioning and intact railway network. If the tracks were destroyed, the world's most powerful tanks would be completely stranded, unable to reach the front lines under their own power. This logistical flaw turned into a tragedy when the Nazis invaded France in 1940. As the German blitzkrieg tore through the French defenses, the 10 Char-2C tanks were loaded onto trains to be moved to the southern front. However, they never fired a single shot in anger. The Luftwaffe targeted the rail lines, and a single destroyed bridge blocked the entire transport convoy. Stuck on the tracks with no way to move and the German army closing in, the French crews were given the heartbreaking order to scuttle their own tanks. They placed explosive charges in the hulls, destroying the pride of the French armored corps before the enemy could capture them. The aftermath of the Char-2C was a propaganda coup for the Germans. They discovered the massive, smoking wrecks on the railway tracks and photographed them from every angle to show the world that the invincible French army had been utterly defeated. One tank, named Champagne, was captured relatively intact and sent back to Berlin as a trophy of war. The Char-2C remains a fascinating example of how a weapon can be technically impressive and visually terrifying, yet completely useless when faced with the speed and unpredictability of modern, mobile warfare. As the First World War reached its brutal climax, Germany attempted to build a machine that would make the British Mark I look like a toy. This was the K-Wagon, or the Großkampfwagen, a 120-ton behemoth that was designed to be the ultimate trench-clearing weapon. It was an exercise in pure industrial madness, intended to be nearly 13 meters long and carried an astonishing amount of firepower. The German High Command believed that a fleet of these monsters could simply roll over the Western Front, ignoring every obstacle and crushing the Allied resistance through sheer, unstoppable mass. The scale of the K-Wagon was so immense that it challenged the very limits of German manufacturing. Because it was too large to be transported by rail as a single unit, the design required it to be built in sections that could be broken down and moved on multiple rail cars. The plan was to reassemble these sections at a specialized workshop located several miles behind the front lines, a process that would have taken days and required heavy cranes and specialized engineers. It was a logistical gamble that ignored the reality of a chaotic, shifting battlefield where every hour mattered. The firepower of the K-Wagon was intended to be unmatched by anything else in the world. It was designed to carry 4 77mm Fortress guns mounted inside sponsons, along with 7 machine guns for defense against infantry. This wasn't just a tank, it was a mobile fortress designed to be operated by a staggering crew of 27 men. This included a commander, 2 drivers, several gunners, loaders, and even a team of mechanics to keep the engines running. The interior would have been a hellish landscape of heat, noise, and smoke, with 27 men fighting for oxygen in a vibrating steel box. Powering a 120-ton machine was an almost impossible task in 1918. The German engineers planned to use 2 650-horsepower Daimler-Benz aircraft engines, providing a total of 1,300 horsepower. However, even with this massive power, the predicted top speed was only about 7 kilometers per hour. The mechanical stress on the transmission and the tracks would have been extreme, and many experts believe the K-Wagon would have likely shaken itself to pieces or snapped its own drive shafts before it ever reached the enemy trenches. Despite the industrial collapse of Germany toward the end of the war, work on 2 prototypes actually began at a factory in Berlin. By late 1918, the first K-Wagon was nearly complete, lacking only its engines and some internal components. The German military hoped that these machines would lead a final, desperate offensive in 1919, but the armistice was signed before the prototypes could be finished. The war ended not with a bang of the K-Wagon's guns, but with the quiet surrender of a nation that had simply run out of resources to fuel its mechanical fantasies. Following the surrender, the Allied Control Commission visited the factory and was stunned by the size of the K-Wagon skeletons they found. Fearing that Germany might try to hide and complete these monsters later, the Commission ordered their immediate destruction. The unfinished giants were cut into pieces with blowtorches and melted down for scrap. The K-Wagon never saw combat, and it remains one of history's greatest what-if weapons, a massive, 120-ton dinosaur that was extinct before it was even born, a symbol of a Germany that tried to solve strategic failure with giant machines. The British Tortoise, or a 39 heavy assault tank, was born out of a very specific and terrifying need, the requirement to break through the Siegfried Line, Germany's massive system of defensive fortifications. During World War II, the British realized they needed a vehicle that could sit in front of a German pillbox, take hit after hit from anti-tank guns, and keep firing until the target was demolished. The result was 80 tons of solid, unyielding British steel. It was designed not for speed or agility, but for pure, brute force endurance, a machine that earned its name by being slow, armored, and nearly impossible to kill. The armor of the Tortoise was its most defining feature. The front of the hull was protected by a cast steel plate up to 228 mm thick, which was nearly unheard of at the time. This wasn't just armor, it was a wall that could shrug off almost any shell fired by the German 88 mm guns. The design opted for a fixed superstructure instead of a rotating turret, which allowed the engineers to pack more armor and a larger gun into the chassis. It made the Tortoise a massive, low-profile target that was incredibly difficult to disable from the front, a true tortoise that could pull its head in and ignore the world. To destroy German bunkers, the Tortoise was armed with one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war, the 32-pounder. This 94 mm cannon was capable of punching through the armor of any German tank from massive distances and could reduce concrete fortifications to rubble with ease. However, because the gun was mounted in a limited traverse mount rather than a turret, the entire 80-ton tank had to be turned to aim at targets that weren't directly in front of it. This made the Tortoise a specialized assault gun rather than a versatile tank, limited to a very specific role on the battlefield. The mobility of the Tortoise was, as the name suggests, pathetic. It was powered by a 600-horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, the same engine used in the much lighter Cromwell tank. In the Tortoise, however, it could only push the 80-ton mass to a top speed of 19 km per hour on a paved road. Off-road, it moved at a crawling pace of about 6 km per hour. It was so slow and so heavy that it required massive, specialized trailers just to move it from the factory to the testing grounds, making it a logistical burden for an army that needed to move fast across Europe. By the time the 6 prototypes of the Tortoise were ready for testing, the war in Europe was already over. The British Army sent one of the tanks to Germany for field trials in 1948, where it was tested against various obstacles and captured German equipment. The tests proved that while the Tortoise was incredibly tough and had a devastating gun, it was completely impractical for the post-war world. It was too wide for most bridges, too heavy for standard transport, and its fixed gun mount was a relic of an era that was being replaced by the age of the main battle tank. The legacy of the Tortoise is one of engineering excellence applied to a problem that had already disappeared. It was the ultimate bunker buster in a world that no longer had bunkers to bust. Of the 6 prototypes built, only one survives today, housed at the Bovington Tank Museum. It remains in running condition, occasionally crawling out for public displays to show modern audiences what an 80-ton wall of steel looks like. It is a slow, heavy, and magnificent fossil from a time when the British believed that the only way to win a war was to build a tank that simply refused to die. As we look back at these 5 iron giants, a clear pattern emerges. The history of the super heavy tank is not a history of victory, but a history of engineering hubris and strategic failure. From the mouse to the Tortoise, these machines were designed by men who believed that size could compensate for a lack of vision. They were impressive on the factory floor and terrifying in propaganda photos, but on the real battlefield, they were nothing more than expensive, slow-moving targets that broke their own bridges and starved for fuel while the rest of the war passed them by. The era of the giant tank is now firmly in the past, replaced by the philosophy of the main battle tank, where balance between speed, firepower, and protection is the key to survival. We have learned that a tank's greatest defense isn't the thickness of its armor, but its ability to move, to hide, and to strike from where the enemy least expects. These 5 monsters remind us that in the brutal arithmetic of war, the biggest machine is rarely the one that brings home the victory. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into military history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, which of these giants would you have hated to drive the most?